So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue today on the chapter about theories of demography. And we were discussing about, more specifically, about the factors that influence migration. And we stopped on this slide here in the last class, talking about these push and pull factors. And with this theoretical framework, what researchers that have been trying to understand why people migrate from one area to the other, both inside countries and between countries, is that there are characteristics of the areas of origin and destination that they make them more likely to leave or to go to a specific area. And whenever we look at these aggregated factors of areas of origin and destination and try to explain why people migrate from one area to the other, always remember about this push and pull factors framework is that is specific areas that, let's say that they have high levels of unemployment, they have high levels of poverty, violence, discrimination, and low availability of social and life partners, or have some environmental disasters like floods and epidemics. If some areas have experiencing these issues, these are factors negative to our life that will make us more likely to get out of those areas. Not necessarily we will get out, but those are factors that influence our decision to move away. So these are examples of push factors, some factors in these specific areas that will make us move away. Other factors in some specific areas might do the opposite. They might attract people to those areas. So maybe some areas are experiencing economic development, economic growth, and they have a high availability of jobs, high availability of employment. They have good universities. They have good educational services that I could take my children to. They have higher income in the jobs that they have availability. So these are factors that will attract people to go there. Some areas have better climate and living conditions. One of the reasons that we start to see more elderly population, retired people moving to the south of the US, like more specifically to Texas, is related to the climate, for example. And if some areas have more availability of activities, even for leisure, not only for work, those might be factors that attract people to go to those areas. So these are called the pull factors. Whenever we have migration from one area to the other, there are both things going on. Both the push factors kind of influencing people to get out, and the pull factors influencing people to move in. And what we have to try to understand, what are the exactly factors that are influencing more these migration flows, people migrating from one specific area to the other. If a specific flow of migrants is mostly due because there are negative factors in this area, I'm not moving to this other country because this other country has much better life conditions than here. I'm moving away from this area, for example, because there is high incidence of violence. Maybe because my family has been threatened. Maybe because we cannot find jobs. This other area that I'm moving to might have better conditions, but the main reason that I'm getting out is because of the bad conditions in the area of origin. If we analyze specific flows of people and the factors, the negative factors in the areas of origin are the ones making people move out more, then the migrants, they will tend to be negatively selected. What does it mean for a migrant to be negatively selected? It means that people who will get affected by these negative factors in those areas, they will tend to get out and move away from those areas, and they will tend to have lower levels of education. They will tend to have lower levels of training, so they will tend to be unskilled in terms of skills that they could perform in the labor market. And when these people with lower levels of education and lower levels of training get out of those areas, proportionally, those areas will have less of the lower educated and lower skilled people. So the areas of origin are changed positively, right? So this is pretty much an example I'm giving here. It's not even a specific example. I'm just giving an abstract idea of how people migrating out of one area to the other is mainly due to the negative effects of area of origin. But let's say that people are moving to a specific area, not because where I live right now is so bad, but because in that other area, with my skills and my knowledge and my family, I will live much better. I will do much better in that area of destination. In that case, the main reason that I'm moving is in response to the good, to the positive factors in the area of destination, the pull factors. So in that case, migrants are positively selected. What does it mean to be positively selected? They will tend to be more better educated. They will tend to have better skills to work in high productive jobs in the labor market. They will tend to be more innovative. So the area of origin loses a valuable segment of the population that's more educated, and they move to other areas of destination. One overall example that we have for this is the brain drain. Highly educated people in less developed countries, Africa and Asian countries, and also in Latin America, whenever they get better education, higher education, whenever they get graduate degree, for example, if they move to developed countries, they might get better job opportunities in the developed countries. So the countries of origin will lose that potential of people with high skills, and the areas of destination, the developed countries in this example, will gain them. So there is a brain drain from these areas that have, they have a high skilled people, but they don't see themselves progressing much in those areas, so they decide to leave, right? But here is just to give you a general idea that migration happens because people think and compare the situation in their areas of origin and the possibility of going to other places. So they compare these areas, they compare educational opportunities for their children, they compare employment opportunities for themselves. And then in these next slides, I will talk about specific theories that try to explain migration. And this part of the lecture is divided into the theories that try to explain internal migration and the ones that try to explain international migration. I will give some examples here throughout the lecture, but the specific examples in how to measure migration rates, we will discuss it in the next chapters, whenever the chapter about migration. The same thing about fertility, the same thing about mortality. We discussed theories of fertility and theories of mortality in these last few classes. And then we're going to talk specifically how to measure, how to calculate mortality, fertility, and migration rates within each chapter of these demographic components. For this part of the lecture here, I'm pretty much going to focus on these different groups and these different theories that try to explain why people migrate from one area to the other within countries. Discuss the Neoclassical migration theory, the new economics of labor migration, spatial temporal migration theories, structuralism, also known as Marxist or center-periphery framework, and the sociological human ecology, which is related to the human ecological theory that we discussed before when we were talking about fertility, right? The neoclassical migration theory is related to the push and pull factors. It takes more into account how migrants calculate migrating from one area to the other based on the geographical differences that we see in these different areas. So the neoclassical economic theory sees migration primarily as a function of geographical differences in the relatively scarcity of labor. So I say, what does it mean, scarcity of labor? If I live in a rural area, we're talking about internal migration. If I live in a rural area, and that rural area, the population is not so big, but even with a small population, I don't have as many good jobs for those people that live there. So I have more people than good jobs. So I'm comparing the people to the jobs available there. And when I look at urban areas, I might say, oh, urban areas, there are more people living there, but there is a greater availability of good jobs, of high-paying jobs. So there is a scarcity of labor relative to the good jobs available in those places. So people will tend to move from these rural areas into the urban areas. It's not just about population density, but it's about the perception about whether I will get better jobs in this other place. And Todaro is an economist who really dig into the reasons of why people migrate from rural to urban areas. And in some cases, in his analysis, he verified that people kept moving from rural to urban areas, although in the urban areas, they were not actually getting as much more, as a better life quality than if they had stayed in the rural area. He realized that people kept moving from some areas to the others, although whenever they got in the destination, their life did not significantly improve. So what he realizes is that this migration, this urbanization process, or more specifically the rural to urban migration, will continue if the perception, if the expectation of people about how much they will make in the urban area exceeds what I make right now in the rural area. When I live in the rural area, I might have some information about the urban area because maybe some of my friends and relatives moved before me. There are also news going on, so I get to know what kind of opportunities are out there. But in some cases, this information is misleading. When I move, my quality of life will not increase. But overall, people will keep moving if their perception about the place of destination, if their expectation about the place of destination is that they will have a better life than where they are right now. And in this perspective here, people are comparing areas of origin and destination. There are these overall push and pull factors going on. But in this more economic framework that tries to understand migration, the result of migration is an individual decision. People decide to move from one area to the other based on their individual decisions and perceptions about how they will do better in this other place. And this framework is also known as the Functionalist Theory, right? Migration causes labor to become less scarce at the destination and scarcer at the origin. So let's say I have a rural area. Okay, population is smaller. but proportionally, not as many jobs there. When people start to get out and move to urban areas, then more people in urban areas will compete to the jobs that are there. So the area of destination will have more labor available to the jobs, so labor becomes less scarce. And the area of origin, I will have less labor available for the jobs back there, so labor will be more scarce at the origin, scarcer at the origin. This process will result in growing convergence between wages at the sending and receiving areas. Do you remember when I talked in the last class that work by Ravenstein from 1885 and 1889? He was talking about exactly this, the regional spatial equilibrium. So if you just go back here in the slides, when he was talking right here, migration is considered to be a mechanism that establishes regional spatial economic equilibrium. It's exactly because people are moving from areas where there are less jobs relative to the population into areas that there are more jobs relative to the population. So people will keep moving in this perspective until there is an equilibrium in terms of job opportunities for people in the areas of origin and destination, right? So this work by Ravenstein and all this debate about push and pull factors is really the core of the neoclassical migration theory that can also be applied to international migration, as we're going to discuss further. But overall, as people start to move from places that have less jobs relative to the population into areas that have more jobs relative to the population, we will tend to create this convergence between those two places. That's the overall rationale, right? If we just take economic decisions into account, people will keep moving until levels of unemployment, levels of poverty, levels of violence are kind of homogeneous across all the areas. Okay? But some people say it's not just economy that explains why people move from one area to the other. There are other factors. People that migrate before me, because of family reasons, I have to migrate with my family members. So there are other reasons. But whatever, I already mentioned that in the previous class. What I'm talking here, whenever I'm showing all these different frameworks that try to explain fertility, mortality, and migration, I'm not saying that we should use just one theoretical framework to understand our problem. We should try to understand all these different frameworks that try to explain migration using different or testing different reasons of why people migrate, right? But the neoclassical migration theory is criticized for that, for focusing a lot on economic reasons and individual reasons of why people migrate from one area to the other. The new economics of labor migration argues that most migration in developing countries can only be understood as a household rather than individual decision. So they try to say, hey, people migrate from one area to the other. It's not just because of decision of specific individuals. It's a household decision. But it's still, the framework is based on economic reasons of why people migrate from one area to the other. When in this perspective here, in the new economics of labor migration, people migrate from one area to the other because that might generate income diversification. It's not necessarily that I will make more money, it's that now I'm going to have more sources of revenues. And one example are remittances. Remittances, we can think both at the internal internal migration level, international migration. When people migrate from one area to the other, maybe just specific family members migrate. It can be within a country or between countries. And then this person who migrates gets a job in their destination. That person might send money back to the relatives that stay back home. So the people back home are making money from the jobs where they are working right now, but they also receive these other resources from people who moved out. So it is a conscious attempt to overcome failing markets and socioeconomic inequalities in the areas of origin, trying to diversify the resources that the family receives, or more specifically, the household receives. The neo-economics of labor migration is a micro-level theory applied to particular forms of migration. It is not able to explain long-term global migration patterns, long-term global migration levels, and how these are connected to broader development processes. It's still in a lower level of analysis. It's still not at the aggregate level. We move from the individual level into the household decisions, but still we are not analyzing how societies are organized, and disparities between areas might make people migrate from one area to the other. It's still a micro level analysis. Spatial temporal migration theories, they define migration as a constituent part of a broader development process. So now we bring more an overall information about how are specific areas within countries developing more than others, and that make people migrate more. Development process tend to coincide with increased levels of migration and overall mobility. And we try to understand not just, oh, these states have better job opportunities than these other states and they attract more migrants. It's not only that, we try to understand why some areas have better levels of development. We try to analyze over time why we have these changes or these differentials across space. Right? So there is a little bit more of a historical perspective in this analysis. And we try to understand the changes in society related to modernization, to the capitalist economic development, to urbanization, and to demographic transitions. Maybe some areas experienced really sharp declines in mortality, followed by fertility declines. And then we have higher proportion of people in labor ages that's creating economic development in that area. And overall, that will attract more migrants. So we try to understand the historical process that created those conditions that make those areas more or less attractive to migrants. In the structuralism theory, trying to understand the reasons of migration, criticizes the functionalist theory. The structuralist theory, the neo-Marxist center periphery theory, sees a general pattern of disruptions, dislocations. The capitalist society creates a series of unequal conditions between people, but also between areas. And you have a lot of inequality in terms of quality of life between areas. And those inequalities make people migrate more from one area to the other. The functionalist theory, remember, the idea is that it's not because of historical factors that make people migrate more from one area to the other. It's just because here I have less jobs available to the population than over there. So I migrate there. With this functionalist theory, this individual level approach, more based on economic reasons or economic rational reasons, we are pretty much saying that this migration will continue until we tend to reach an equilibrium in terms of opportunities in those areas. In other words, migration will stop when we reach this equilibrium. It's not really emphasized these historical processes that have been influencing one area, attracting more migrants than others. So the structuralist and the functionalist theories, they have different perspectives, right? The functionalist is more at the individual level. Individuals decide to move to those areas because they see more opportunities over there for them. And the migration flows will continue until you reach an equilibrium. The structuralist approach brings historical reasons into the debate, says that the capitalist society brings inequality to the country, and then different areas within that country will have different opportunities, and then people will keep migrating because of all these disruptions and that influence these locations, migration flows of people. Although they have these differences, they still have similar assumptions. They both assume that more development leads to less immigration. If a specific area experiences economic development that will generate more job opportunities, then less people will try to move out from those areas. And higher development across these areas. So whenever we have more spatial disequilibrium, more differences between areas, that will lead to more migration. The thing is that the functionalist theory said, yeah, this spatial disequilibrium will make people migrate from one area to the other until you reach an equilibrium. The structuralist theory says, no, this spatial disequilibrium is related to historical factors that will continue to be there in our society of how the capitalist society is organized. These inequalities will continue to be there. So we're not going to reach this magical point in which migration will stop, because the spatial disequilibrium is simply the effect of how the capitalist society is organized. So migration will continue to happen in the future. We will never reach this magical point of equilibrium that the functionalists emphasize, right? So both these frameworks, they do have different perspectives of why migration happens, but both of them have also similar assumptions. And I will show I don't show here in these slides, right? I could have shown here. There is a slide that I pretty much show this pattern here in a graphical format. In the chapter about migration itself, let me just see here if I can find the slide on chapter 8 or chapter 9 that I didn't upload this there. Let me get from the last semester. Chapter 8 and chapter 9. Sorry. I just want to show you. This specific graph that kind of like shows in a graphical format what I'm talking here right now. This graph here. In this slide here, what I was talking about, more development leads to less immigration. Where is it? Here. More development in specific areas will lead in the long term with less immigration. really, really, really low levels of development, if I have areas or countries that have really low levels of development, people don't even have the resources to move away. So the chances to move away are really low. As these areas develop a little bit, people will have more resources now to know about other areas, to move to those areas, then the level of immigration increases. But as these areas reach really high levels of development, they don't want to move out anymore because they have all the opportunities there. So immigration rates decline. So we are talking here about immigration in this case here. We can also talk about immigration. As areas develop a lot, they will have more job opportunities, better quality of life. They will attract more people. So the levels of immigration will increase. If we are talking now about internal migration, it's the same idea, but here we are talking about out migration, and here we are talking about in migration, to use the correct terms, right? But out migration tends to be really low in areas that are really, really less developed. People don't even have money to travel. They don't know about other job opportunities, but as they get some little bit more better conditions and get to know about these other places, out migration might increase. But as the areas start to develop a lot, the chances of getting out will decline. And that's exactly what I'm saying, what is said here in this slide. And also the second assumption is that we have differences across areas. People will keep moving from one area to the other. Functionalist approach will say we will reach this point in which there will be an equilibrium. Areas are similar in terms of opportunities. The structuralist theory says, no. This magical point is not going to be reached because the capitalist society is based on all these unequal opportunities and inequality across areas. And that's not going to change in the capitalist society, okay? The sociological human ecology approach brings that aggregate level perspective that we talked about, the migration, the fertility theory as well. Ecological theory of migration focuses on population characteristics to predict migration. It's not at the individual level. It is not at the household level. They try to understand why some areas increase through migration, why some areas decrease because of migration, why some other areas are not influenced by migration. It does not ask why individuals move. It does not ask why specific households made the conscious decision to migrate, right? Migration is the major mechanism of social change and adaptability of human populations. Populations redistribute themselves via net migration to attain equilibrium. But it's not really focusing on the fact that specific individuals rationally expect to have a better life in another place and then they move. It's not like the Neoclassical economic theory. Here, we are talking about at the aggregate level. The data is looked at the aggregate level, not at the individual level. And it's pretty much based on the interdependence, as is mentioned in the textbook, of these four concepts: population, organization, environment, and technology. What's the population size, population distribution, population characteristic of a specific country, of a specific area within a country? How are they organized in terms of institutions? Is it a well-developed society? How is it the environment in terms of resources available to them? They don't have too many resources. They have good technological advancements, so they can produce more with fewer resources. But if they don't have enough resources, not good economic, technological development, advancements, then they don't have as much capacity of producing, and people will tend to move away from these places, right? We look at the aggregate level, population characteristics, how that society is organized, what are the resources available into that place in terms of the environment, and how is the society developed in terms of technological aspects. And now we go into international migration theories. Here in international migration theories, I'm going to focus on this paper by Douglas Massey and his colleagues. Douglas Massey already mentioned, professor from Princeton University, most well-known researcher, professor on the topic about migration, and specific about internal migration in the US and in the world. And he has some great papers, this 1994 paper and also another 1997 paper, in which he kind of summarizes what are the major theories that try to explain international migration. This 1994 paper is more theoretical. He explains and he gives, he goes back to previous studies, so he pretty much does a literature review, summarizing previous studies that analyze migration and put them into these different groups. A group that tries to explain why international migration starts from one country to the other, and why after it has started, why migration continues. And within each one of these groups, he subdivides it. For those theories that try to understand why migration from countries they start, there is the Neoclassical economic theory related to the one that we also discussed for internal migration, the new household economics of migration, segmented labor migration theory, and world systems theories. These different frameworks, theories, they are kind of associated to the ones that we just talked about internal migration. But here now we are talking more in a world view, because we are talking about flows between countries, not anymore only within countries. And after migration starts, there are some reasons that make migration to continue. And he subdivides these different theories into the network theory or social network theory, institutional theory, and cumulative causation. And after he discusses these theories in this 1994 paper, there is an interesting paper that he wrote in 1997 with another colleague, Espinosa, that he again summarized, but much more short, in a short way, these theories, and he tries to understand which one of these theories are better fit to explain the migration between Mexico to the US. So he does what I'm trying to emphasize here to you guys. It's not that we just take one group of theory to explain a migration flow. In this case, he's trying to understand migration from Mexico to the US, but he doesn't take just one migration theory to explain it. He analyzes all of them and he collects this data. He coordinated a project called the Mexican Migration Project that they collect data in Mexico. And they went there to the households in Mexico and asked, did anyone from your household move to the US? So they get information from the areas of origin. And then they also get data in the US about where migrants are coming. They collect their own data as well. They use data from the Census Bureau, and they analyze also data from the Mexican Census Bureau. How is it called? INEGI, Instituto Nacional de Estatística y Geografia, things like that. INEGI, INEGI. So he collects data from the American Census Bureau and the Mexican Census Bureau. And data that he collected from areas of origin in Mexico, data that he collected here in the US, and also other data that some other institutions collect in the US, and he puts this all into his analysis. And he says, these variables here that are measuring differentials between areas of origin and destination, they are good to try to measure the push and pull factors. So they are kind of like related to the Neoclassical economic theory. These are the variables that tell me that some households in Mexico are receiving remittances from other relatives that move out and went to the US. This is talking about those theories that discuss about the diversity in income, people diversifying income to the household. So he's trying to measure this theory. He also has information in that survey that he applied with the Mexican Migration Project in the areas of origin. How many people from your household moved away? Do you have friends that moved out to the US before your relatives moved out? So they try to capture all these different networks, this knowledge that make people more likely to migrate from one area to the other. All these variables they collected. So they say those variables that tell me whether those people know friends or have relatives that migrated before to the US will test the social network theory. So he is pretty much getting data from all these different sources in order to test all these different theories. And he puts all this data, all these variables. Remember, we talked at the beginning of the semester, what about variables? Think about that data set. Variables are my columns. I have all these different variables. Individual level variable, household, what are the individual level variables? My age, education, if I migrated before to the US, household, if my household receives remittances, country, what's the unemployment rate in my area? What's the unemployment rate of the area, the destination where my relatives moved out to? So I have this huge database with a series of different variables in my columns and a series of individuals being analyzed, but the variables here are not only at the individual level. I also have household level variables, area level variables. Individuals that live in the same household, they will have similar characteristics in the household, so it's repeated. Individuals that have in the same area, the unemployment rate will be the same for all of them, so it's repeated within that area. But it varies across areas. Anyways, I'm just trying to show you that you have to collect all these different sources of data, and each group of variables will test one specific theoretical framework. And that's what he does in this 1997 paper. And then he emphasizes that what's actually driving, making the Mexico-US migration continue over time is really related to social network. Nowadays, the levels of migration from Mexico to the US dropped a lot, so the net migration between the two countries is really zero. But overall, what makes people migrate from Mexico to the US in more recent years is related to all these networks that people have with all the individuals that migrated before to the US. It's not only economic factors, right? But this is to show, I'm not showing these different frameworks to say that one is better than the other. What we have to do is to test them all. Why we don't test them all usually? Because it's really hard to have so much data, to have so many variables to test each one of these each one of these theories here. But that's what Massey did in his Mexican Migration Project by collecting his own data and linking into data from other places. So let's discuss a little bit more these specific theories. Within the initiation of international migration, there's the Neoclassical economics theory, the supply-demand framework related to the Neoclassical that we saw before for internal. The new household economics of migration. Households try to diversify their sources of income, for example, with remittances. And also related to the new labor economic migration theory that we discussed before. The segmented labor market theory is pretty much more looking at the demand side, not only at people wanting to move because of their supply of labor. It looks in the other way around. Those economies, some specific economies, they might have more job opportunities for well-educated people, for people with higher levels of training. So in that case, the primary sector on those countries will tend to attract more well-educated people and give them good salaries and benefits. But the same countries that attract people to work in their primary sector also might have jobs in the secondary sector that attracts people that would move there to work for lower wages, more unstable jobs that can be fired more easily. And these kind of jobs are usually rejected by the population born in those countries. So immigrants move in to take those jobs that are rejected by the native population. And that's one example from this is exactly the US. The US attracts all kinds of people, all kinds of immigrants. Some immigrants are more well-educated. They will tend to get jobs that have better wages, better benefits. They are in the primary sector in the sense that they are more productive jobs and these people will have a better quality of life. But also here in the US, there are some low-paying jobs that immigrants would also take, those that have lower levels of education and skills. But why would they take? Because even these low-paying jobs here in the US are better than what they would have in their country of origin, right? So countries might have different levels of development, attracting people more into their primary or secondary sector, depending on a specific time and varying across countries. And the world system theory is kind of related to the overall analysis of the capitalist society when we talked about the new Marxist approach that says that the capitalist economy creates inequality within areas in a country, between areas in a country, and between countries. And all these inequalities, these differences in opportunities across areas within and between countries will make people move to other areas. And when we talk about international migration, peripheral countries, less developed countries, are most likely to send migrants to core nations, right? And in this case, we are bringing into the date not only individual level reasons, household level reasons, or even national reasons. We are talking about an overall organization of the human society in the whole world, right? So if you want to think, it's kind of an individual level analysis. You bring in household level analysis, a national level analysis that specific countries attract people more to this primary or secondary sector, and a world level analysis in which you try to understand these differentials across countries. and going a little bit into each one of these theories. The Neoclassical economic theory of international migration is the oldest and best known. It focuses on labor migration. So the Neoclassical economic theory related to Ravenstein, right? The spatial regional equilibrium, spatial regional economic equilibrium, the push and pull factors. We are talking about economic factors that usually make people migrate from one area to the other. But the push and pull factors could be other things that not only economics. Yes, and we talked about them before. The Neoclassical economics of migration focus on economic factors, on labor. People migrating due to labor opportunities. Migration happens because of individual decisions. People say, is it dangerous to move to another country? Is it expensive to move to another country? But what are the benefits? So I evaluate the costs and the benefits of my move from one country to the other. If the benefits exceed the costs, or at least the perceived costs, I would tend to migrate, right? If the negative expectations about the migration exceed the good things that I expect from migrating, I would tend to stay. People move from low-wage countries to high-wage countries. So it's really related to economic reasons, right? And really related even to the urbanization process when we are talking about the neoclassical economic theory as well, which is internal migration, but these theories apply to both internal and international. New household economics theory of migration challenged the neoclassical in the sense that migration decisions are not only decided by isolated individuals. It's at the household level, at the family level, people make decisions. People make decisions with their family, within their household, to decide to move from one area to the other. Migration in this perspective happens exactly because people want to increase individual earnings, as well as to minimize the household risks and protect the family unit as a whole from possible failures that the labor markets are experiencing in some areas, right? This new household economic theory, not necessarily this, all the family members are moving together. Maybe one member of the family, a couple of members of the family move, the others stay, and the ones who move send money back, remittances back home. And that improves the lives of those who stayed back home, right? That is still a good theoretical framework to explain internal and international migration. And international migration, because of these increases in remittances from migrants that send money back home, it's a really strong way to understand this process. The segmented labor migration theory, migration flows are a result of the demands of the economic structure of industrial societies. Again, you're looking at the aggregate level. See, the push and pull factor important here. Some societies have more job opportunities. They demand, they want more labor. Some countries have less job opportunities. They don't have as many opportunities for those people. So people will move away, they will supply labor to other areas. And as we discussed before, the capitalist society divides the labor markets into two sectors. Because of that, this theory is known as a dual labor market theory, with the idea that even within countries, you have the primary and the secondary sector, as I mentioned before. In the primary sector, you have more secure jobs, high paying, better benefits, and good work conditions. In the secondary sector, unstable jobs, low paying, limited benefits, and more dangerous working conditions. Employers use migrants to fill jobs in the secondary sector, but some countries as well might have immigrants supplying or immigrants working in the primary sectors. And that's really the case of the US, right? I'm an immigrant working a nice job in the US, I'm working the primary sector. But usually most of the immigrants proportionally tend to go to more unstable jobs, low paying jobs, okay? And the world systems theory emphasizes that migration is a result of this globalization of the labor market economy. In the process of global industrialization, now that we have technological advancements and everything, people don't work as much in farming, so they get out from these traditional industries, state-owned industries and handicrafts, and this creates more migration flows across these countries. It creates a mobilized population to move both within countries and between countries. The global market economy attracts employees with higher human capital to specific global cities. What is human capital? People that have better knowledge or they have better education, better training, higher experience in the labor market, better skills, again, in terms of training. And with higher education, that brings higher productivity. So with the same hour of one individual, I will tend to make more revenue to a country. And usually specific cities attract a lot of those immigrants known as the global cities, such as New York, LA, and Chicago. Right? So in the world market, in the world systems theory, we are talking about this process of development that we see overall in the world. Still some economies based on agricultural activities, but moving away from that as we see technological advancement, and people tend to move out from those places and move to more developed areas, both within countries and between countries. Okay? And then he emphasizes those three theories that try to say, okay, these other theories try to explain why some migration flows, they start. And now that we have established migration flow, why people keep migrating, even in some cases that job opportunities are not as different, that you don't have so much of an instability at the household level, for example. And then he explains the network theory, the institutional theory, and the cumulative causation. And here I cite a 1997 paper that I mentioned before, in which he tests the theories with this really big database with variables, trying to measure the relevance, so trying to test each one of these theories that he discusses here. The network theory, migrants establish interpersonal ties. Once started, migration sustains itself through diffusion. Now I know someone who migrated to another country, either a friend or a relative, so I'll be more likely to migrate to that area. Even though I could get a good job where I am right now, but because I have some friends there, that facilitates my move. I have some housing. They can help me find a job much easier. So the costs are lower, right? Cost in this case is not just in terms of money. It's because I can stay with them they have a boss who is looking for an employee, so I can get a job much easier. The institutional theory, institutions facilitate or profit from the continued flow of migrants. Organizations help perpetuate migration in the face of government attempts to limit the flow of migrants. Organizations help perpetuate migration in the face of government attempts to limit the flows of migrants. What is a really good example of this kind of institutional? What's a really good example of a migration flow that's really well explained by this institutional theory? Forced migration. Slaves from Africa to South America, to Central America, to North America. Why migration of slaves continue even when the government was trying to end slavery in several of these countries? Because private companies benefited from them. Farmers benefited from them. Slavery was beneficial to all these different industries. So although the government was pushing back after a while, of course, and sometimes it was actually facilitating, after a while tried to stop, abolish slavery, but these industries would not change suddenly, so they kept trying to bring slaves, or at least to keep the slaves that they had at that time. Institutional theory is really good to explain these historical factors when international migration was really influenced by specific governments. Slavery in Brazil ended in 1888. And then we started to have some changes, some moves from agricultural production into a little bit of like the start of the industrial economy. And then in the 1930s, we have what at that time people would call the Bourgeois revolution in Brazil, which were more like the industries, they got political power. And in that time, the federal government really incentivized migration from other countries to fulfill specific industries in the country, even in agriculture, not just in industry. So back in the 1930s, that's when the government started to incentivize migration from Japan to Brazil, from Italy, from Germany. So there is a high proportion of the population in São Paulo, in the state of São Paulo, that has ties with Italy. In the south of Brazil, with Germany. Also in São Paulo, with Japan, right? In those cases, these people would come into Brazil to work also in agriculture, and they were bad paying jobs, really bad conditions, and they were trying to bring labor into the country. And it was really a clear government decision. In that case, the government was working to increase those migration flows. So it was a really clear institutional example of how international migration was influenced by the public sector. And finally, Douglas Massey discusses the cumulative causation theory, that migration is influenced by all these factors that we are discussing here, but migration also has some impacts in our societies, has effects both in the areas of origin, the sending areas, and the areas of destination, the receiving areas. Migration is influenced by individual factors, by household level factors, by area level factors, by world dynamics, but also influence those factors, how a society is organized. There is a reverse causality there, right? Migration changes the culture of the receiving areas, changes the composition of the receiving population. Okay, so there is this process of continuous influences of factors on migration and vice versa. And just going a little bit, talking a little bit more about network theory. The migration network theory focuses on interpersonal ties. It goes beyond economic analysis. I not only move from one country to the other because I will get better jobs, but that's because I know people there that will make it easier for me to get a job because they know a place, a restaurant, for available there. These ties connect migrants, formal migrants, potential migrants, and non-migrants between the areas of origin and destination. I mean, economists usually make fun of this term social network that was more developed by sociologists by saying, oh, you're pretty much just creating all these terms to talk about the effects of friends. But this is really strong. This explains how our society is. If you go to different, I think restaurants is a really good way to look at this, at the examples in our society. Here in College Station, here at Texas A&M. If you go to the MSC to eat something, you will see that in each one of those places where people are working, they are really similar to each other within those places in terms of race, ethnicity. There is something going on there that some groups were attracted to those jobs because they have these interpersonal ties. It's not necessarily because they're the most well-qualified people to work in that job for the lowest amount of money. It's not just because they want to do any job for the lowest amount of money. It's not just because of economic reasons. It's sociological. It's related to how these people interact in the labor market. They know someone who worked there and that person told the boss that they know someone else, that they can trust that person. It's a really hard work, and then that person will work there. Maybe the boss could pay someone half of the salary, but the boss doesn't have that connection with it, doesn't have any more information about those other people. So the way that our society is organized in a realistic basis is not just because of economic factors. It's really related to these interpersonal ties that we have. It's really related to these social networks. So these networks, they increase the likelihood of migration. They decrease the risks and costs. I can move from one country to the other because I know people living there that will help me finding a job. It decreases the possible negative effects that I will have after this long move. They increase the net earnings to migration. What does it mean? The earnings that I have in the area of origin compared to what I'm going to make afterwards, it's going to be a huge difference. If I have good friends, they will get me good jobs. If I have these good interpersonal ties. They make it easier for migrants to find jobs and access resources in the area of destination. Resources, even where there is a nice grocery store that I can get really good products for a cheaper price. Where can I take my kids to have fun during the weekend? Where can I buy a cheaper car? Where can I rent a nice house for a cheaper price? All those things, they are maximized when I have these interpersonal ties. Okay? And so here in the references, I show the studies by Todaro, the one who focused more on the urbanization. Ravenstein, this historical thought about how migration was going to happen, it really influences the Neoclassical migration theory. Our textbook, and also this other textbook that I used throughout the semester, and Massey's papers, right? The 1997 is a really interesting paper. And it's available for free if you access the internet on Google, just put this reference there in the university, in a computer that's it's linked to the A&M wireless, you can access it for free. If you do it from home, you won't. And here in the website, under this one is the semester, yeah. No, I'm talking about theories of demography right here. This is a really funny, did you watch it? It's really funny. A friend of mine, Matt Howard, he's a professor at Florida State University, and he just made this animation, how would you call that, a cartoon animation, of like different demographers, or like discussing the theories of demography. So there is Malthus and all these different people that Enrich, these people that I mentioned here. And just watch it, it's really funny. Like Matt Howard is this guy here. He's a professor at Florida State University. And I saw this, I follow him on Twitter. I saw this a while ago. And then I asked him for it and I uploaded to my YouTube channel. So he knows that's in my YouTube channel and he knows that I show to my students. And these other ones, this video by the Population Reference Bureau and this one by the American Museum of Natural History shows the overall increase in population size, distribution of population, and what are the major factors that make our population be what it is today. But you should watch it. This one, how long is it? I can just show the beginning here so you can see. It just keeps going, but yeah, 3 minutes long. You should watch this. How's that? Yeah, it's really funny. And but you should even like watch. Did you learn from it? It's cool, right? You should watch it, and even before you take the quizzes, it helps, you know. And then you can pause sometimes because he writes a lot of text there. And it's really fun. And he's a really creative professor, researcher. And yeah, so just to show, go back here to the syllabus. I'm just open here. So we are behind in our schedule, as you know. We today finished the chapter about theories of demography. So we are 2 days late, but the date of the exam is going to be the same. And today we have quiz 8. And the topic of quiz 8 is going to be only related to theories of demography. And next Tuesday, we're going to start on the chapter about the sources of demographic information. I will show you these short lecture slides explaining what are the different sources of information. And I will try to show you some examples of places where we can collect data. And the links are available in the course website. At the bottom here of the course website, I will just go to some of these websites and show it to you. And then we will move forward into the chapter about fertility, okay? So thank you very much. I see you guys on next week. Have a great weekend.